What's up, everybody? Just want to take a quick second and let people know that I am self-supported. I now put all of my episodes on Substack for paid subscribers. I put them up early, and then 24 hours later, I release them to the public on all my platforms. I also have Venmo, PayPal, Cash App, Buy Me a Coffee, Zelle, a PO Box, and I don't think Locals, Patreon. And all of the links are in the show notes of every single episode I put out. So look forward to continuing to provide great conversations. And thank you all for your continued support. Doomberg, great to meet you. Thanks for doing this.
Mike, great to be here. Looking forward to it.
This is my first, almost 1,200 episodes. The first time I've ever had a green chicken on the show before. So this is a new. I've reached a new milestone. So thank you.
Well, you know what we like to say in the marketing world is, if you can't be remembered if you don't stand out, and so it's always good to be a set of one.
People will always remember you, right? No one ever forgets you.
That's right.
So, there's so much going on right now. And, even we were just talking offline. Erdogan's at the White House today. You've got Russia, Ukraine. You had the Charlie Kirk from a couple of weeks ago, which is, can't believe it's been over 2 weeks now. You've got the Middle East. What's grabbing your attention?
I think the main overriding geopolitical issue of the day is, and the way that I frame this might be controversial to some listeners, the main issue is, how does NATO lose this war in Ukraine, which is something we have been flagging since the spring of 2024 in one of our premium presentations that we put out for our pro tier called Sleepwalking into the Abyss. Back then, of course, President Biden was in office, and it was clear to us that the war in Ukraine was lost. Now, should define the term. A lost war doesn't mean that one side has yet been defeated. It just means that the outcome is no longer really in doubt. And the war in Ukraine was lost, in our view, and in the minds of other geopolitical analysts, when the 2023 counteroffensive by Ukraine was defeated by Russia. In other words, the goals of that counteroffensive were not met. And then the war pivoted to a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, Russia must win. It is substantially larger, substantially more powerful, has far more people, has a far more developed military-industrial complex, and try as NATO has tried, you cannot compete with local supply chains, especially if your own supply chains have a heavy reliance on China, which is aligned to Russia in this conflict, even though they publicly speak as though they're neutral. So the United States cannot, with its NATO allies, field and equip an army that does not involve its own troops, in other words, relies exclusively on Ukrainian soldiers, and expect to defeat Russia militarily in a conventional war, at least. And everybody assumes that nuclear war is off the table on both sides, which we hope is at least one of the axioms of analysis here. And so once it became clear that this was a war of attrition, how NATO would lose that war has been top of mind for us for the past year and a half. And one of the reasons that you shouldn't get into wars is they're particularly hard to lose, and taking the L, as we would say, is incredibly challenging. And Trump is many things, one of which is a person who likes to think of himself as a winner. And this war in Ukraine risks bogging down so much of the rest of his domestic agenda. And so that's really the thing that concerns us the most. Everything else is sort of secondary to that. We noted with great interest Trump's Truth Social post, where he said, Ukraine could take back all of its territory and even more. Maybe even they'll they'll march on Moscow. We immediately knew that was sarcasm, and we immediately knew that was Trump dumping the Ukraine situation onto Europe. And we read with amazement, like straight reporting in the Financial Times in the aftermath of that post, as though this is to be taken literally. And so, if your worldview doesn't include the fundamental conclusion that the war was lost in December of 2023, it can be difficult to ascertain what Trump is actually saying. But if you know what's actually going on, or you have a good sense of what's actually going on, then such things become clearer. But we're in a very dangerous time right now, Mike. False flag risk extraordinarily high. Barely a day goes by where there isn't some frenzy in the European press about some drone or some flights being canceled, or some aircraft flying over an abandoned island in the middle of the ocean and claiming it's some severe violation of sovereignty, and let's trigger Article 4 or Article 5 of the NATO agreement. It's a very, very dangerous time, and how the situation in Ukraine ultimately resolves, because all wars eventually end, is the question of the day.
Well, even wasn't it last night that there was news out that the Russian planes were getting very close to Alaskan airspace?
Sure. I mean, these types of things happen all the time. They take on a greater consequence when people are looking for reasons to escalate. Trump is surrounded by people who would very much like to go to war, who don't view Russia as a strong power, who don't view Russia's nuclear capabilities as something to fear. I have no understanding as to how they come to such crazy conclusions, but they exist. The Lindsey Grahams of the world, the Mitch McConnells of the world, I would bet 80% of Congress thinks that Russia's a paper tiger, as Trump referred to them in his Truth Social post. I think Trump knows. I think a lot of smart people around Trump know, including J.D. Vance. But he's threading a needle. He has to balance the politics domestically with the international affairs. But to say that Russia is a pushover and its nuclear weaponry is not to be feared, I think is quite naive.
How do you view Putin today and Russia overall in terms of the strength in the world?
I think it's just, again, any unbiased assessment is Russia is on the ascent.
This episode is brought to you by Vaulted. Launched by McIlvaney Financial Group, with Vaulted, I literally just tap a button and bam, I own physical gold stored in a professional vault. I can also take delivery at any time, extremely simple and less expensive than any other method. The do-it-yourself way to buy precious metals. Click on the promo link in the show notes or go to vaulted.blbvux.net/coffeeandamike. I mean, look at how easy this is. The Vaulted app on my phone, I can access it at any time.
It has defeated the sanctions war, thoroughly defeated the sanctions war. And we predicted as much all the way back in April of 2022, when it was wildly unpopular to say such things. We wrote a piece called Crazy Pills, where we not only predicted that the sanctions against Russia would fail, but that they would backfire, and they have. And it's long past time for the people who have been wrong on everything, but are still in power, to start listening to alternative views, especially those with some experience in industry, which we have, who could have explained from the beginning that you can't sanction Russia's energy. The world needs it. Our view is that the U.S. Navy should be escorting every Russian oil tanker to market to make it as frictionless as possible to get every molecule of oil and gas to market that Russia is willing to provide, because that will lower prices and impact Russia's profit. Anybody with any experience in commodities knows that all profits are made on price, not volume. And if you try to sanction Russia's volume, price is going to spike to the point where they're just going to make it up on price. And that's what happened. You can't, if the world were choked off of Russia's oil and gas completely and totally starting tomorrow, the U.S. Navy, instead of escorting these tankers, somehow successfully implemented a total blockade on Russia, blew up all the pipelines connecting Russia to the outside world, and just said Russia's energy is staying in the ground. We'll show Putin the world economy would collapse in weeks. Mass starvation, total destruction of the financial industry. People don't understand just how inelastic the demand for energy is and just how important Russia is in the world of energy exports. And so it was always incredibly foolish to the point of insane to even embark on this strategy, let alone to persist, for Trump to persist on a failed Biden strategy, 3.5 years into this war, is the height of insanity and of lunacy. It's so obvious to anybody with any experience at all that this is how it would have gone. The best evidence that something was predictable is to have predicted it. And here we are.
Are you surprised of the way Trump has handled this since he came back into office?
I'm totally surprised. I don't know what spell Lindsey Graham holds over Donald Trump. And I say Lindsey Graham as a proxy for the uniparty, neocon, pro-war wing of Washington, D.C., who thinks that there's no such thing as a bad war, that U.S. military supplies are infinite, that no power in the world can even begin to compare to the almighty U.S. of A. It's incredible that people exist like this. Lord knows what their motivations are. But I would challenge you, Mike, to name the last war that the U.S. won. And but Grenada doesn't count. I mean, what are we talking about here? And so to think that the United States is going to defeat Russia militarily on the ground in a conventional war right next door to Russia, when they have the backing of China, North Korea, and Iran, good luck to you. It's not going to happen.
This is where I get conflicted with this, trying to, not that you can ever figure this out, because when you think you have something figured out, it changes so rapidly. But do you think Trump's goal is to break Russia away from China or vice versa?
Well, I think that's lost, and Biden lost that. So Russia and China are fused in what can only be described as one of the greatest geopolitical blunders of all time, Biden administration's handling of the Ukraine affair. Trump would like to wash his hands of all of it and focus on the Western Hemisphere. That's been very clear from day one. There's plenty to do in this neighborhood. Greenland, the Arctic, Venezuela, Guyana, Argentina, you name it. There's plenty to do here. The U.S. has an enormous amount of challenges internally, domestically. You referenced the Charlie Kirk affair in your opening question. What does, Trump really care about who rules the Russian-speaking part of the Donbass? How is this in the U.S.'s strategic interests? This is, as Trump correctly says, a war that would have never started if he had won the election in 2020. But that is not good enough now. You're president in 2025. Like, what's the plan? And I think if Trump had his way and was not pressured from that forever war party in Washington, he would have washed his hands of this war on January 20th. Said, the U.S. is no longer involved in this war. This is Biden's war, and I, President Trump, I'm done with it. And then people say, well, what about Ukraine? I mean, there's no question that this is an utter catastrophe for Ukraine. It was a catastrophe for Ukraine from the moment Boris Johnson went to Kiev and told Vladimir Zelensky to discard the Istanbul Agreement, which would have ended hostilities only weeks after it started. History will not be kind to Boris Johnson. Who knows who put him up to that? But nonetheless, the Ukrainians were convinced by their Western allies that they could defeat Russia using the weapons and the money the allies would provide them. That was wrong. They have not defeated Russia. Russia is winning a war of attrition. And the country of Ukraine has been effectively destroyed by this entire affair. Contemporary analysis would say that all of the blame goes to Putin. We'll see how history treats the affair.
In simple terms, why wouldn't the United States just cut off the funding to Ukraine and just push it all on Europe?
That's effectively what Trump's post implies he intends to do, if you ask me. It's something he's wanted to do. You remember, I'm old enough to remember when Zelensky, Trump, and J.D. Vance got into an unprecedented argument in front of the media in the Oval Office. I thought everything was done back then. For whatever reason, Trump was pulled back into the fold by the Europeans, by the neocons. By the way, the deal Ukraine could have gotten back then is not the deal they could get now, and it won't be the deal they'll get in 1 month or 2 months or 6 months as the front keeps slowly moving and the war of attrition grinds on. Say what you will about Putin, he has been incredibly consistent about what Russia's ambitions are in this regard. And the refusal of many on the West to even listen to what the Russians are saying is a root cause of this entire mess, in our view. You can read Putin's speeches if you just read what Putin has said, as published by the Kremlin, which puts out English versions of all of these things, it's very little in the way of variance of his position since 2022. Root causes, right, is what they talk about all the time. You never hear Putin or Sergei Lavrov or Putin's spokesman talk about the war in Ukraine without referencing root causes. And what they mean is they would like a secure, a security architecture for Europe that respects the national security needs of both Europe, Russia, and the United States. And unless and until that happens, the war's going to go on. So all this talk about ceasefires and sanctions, they're just irrelevant. It's just noise. Solve the problem, and the problem will be solved.
Well, also with this, how concerned are you then in relation to BRICS and the moving away from the dollar as a reserve currency as it ties into everything else that's going on?
Personally, I'm not very concerned about it because it has to happen. It's the sort of the thermodynamic end state of the global economy. The Western-based, U.S. dollar-based financial system it's in its last innings. The reason I own a lot of gold is because gold will return to its natural role of a neutral reserve asset for the settlement of imbalances in international trade. Right now, or at least until 2022, U.S. Treasuries and other Western-based debt, notably European-based debt, served as the neutral reserve asset amongst central bankers for the settlement of imbalances in international trade. And once Russia was sanctioned and its largely European-based reserves were frozen, the neutrality of those assets went out the window. Nobody thinks that U.S. Treasuries are neutral. Any, leader of a government that has ever been or may yet be, under the lens of U.S. government scrutiny has to view their Treasury assets as being susceptible to confiscation. So why would you put your savings in something that could be taken away? I think the actions against India and Brazil, the B and the I of BRICS, is no coincidence. This entire episode, by the way, we have a mental model where we think the world has been in World War III since around 2013 or 2014 with the initial forays into Ukraine. And when Putin decided to sell his treasuries and put much of Russia's central bank's reserves into gold, that was the real trigger, combined with Shanghai physical gold exchange being developed by China. And so you're beginning to see the replacing of U.S. treasuries in the oil trade, for example, with gold. And that probably explains gold's unrelenting run-up since the war broke out in 2022, especially if you plot it in, Chinese RMB, for example.
So where do you see, as we sit here end of September, where do you see this playing out for the rest of the year in relation to United States involvement with Russia and Ukraine, and then Europe's involvement?
I think recognizing the defeat in Ukraine by NATO defeat of NATO by Russia in Ukraine will be the end of the European Union. Probably not in 2025, but it's hard to see how Brussels persists in its current form when you take an L like that. And this is why they're so desperate to keep the war going. And all of these obvious false flags, like let's just call them what they are, the drones into Poland and the Denmark airport and the Estonian air violations and even this latest Alaska report. These are false flags meant to escalate the war to keep the U.S. involved. The moment this war is recognized and accepted as being lost, you're going to see political revolutions across the power structures of Europe. Macron, 15% popularity, violent protests in Paris. Starmer, can you even measure his popularity in the UK? Yes, the UK is not yet in the EU again, but Starmer and the Uniparty that in London is working to bring the British back into the European Union fold. Merz in Germany, his highly unnatural coalition is already fraying at the edges. Upcoming elections in Moldova, probably going to trigger a military response by Ukraine, which would trigger a military escalation by Russia because of Transnistria. They stole an election in Romania, let's call it what it was. Austria, right-leaning populist party wins a plurality of the vote, can't form a government. In France, they arrest Le Pen. They went full Trump on Le Pen. Upcoming election in early October in the Czech Republic. Right-leaning candidate seems to be winning, and suddenly we're seeing stories about Russian propaganda flooding the field in that country. There's only so long all of these plates can be kept spinning, and as soon as one or two or three of them start hitting the floor, it's hard to see how the entire European architecture, the EU project, isn't a casualty of this adventure.
When you say casualty, do you see some type of kinetic conflict within these countries, either internally or with each other?
No, I see countries leaving the EU, which is hard to do. Hungary, Slovakia are the obvious ones. I see fiscal crises in France and in Britain, already on the edge of such crises. And ultimately, the unpopularity of Brussels, which, of course, the European media does its level best to paper over with a relentless assault of propaganda. Who voted for Ursula von der Leyen? Who thinks Kaja Kallas is whatever her name is? Kaja Kallas is a diplomat of some renown that the Chinese are going to respect when she goes to Beijing and scolds them. The European Union is a laughingstock in the world. It has no function. It has no utility. It provides no value. And so that which can't go on forever usually doesn't. And there's just no question that Europe is by far the biggest loser of all of these events. It's an energy vassal. It has, just think about it. Let's imagine you're Europe 5 years ago. What was Europe 5 years ago? The European Union. You were getting dirt cheap natural gas from Russia, predominantly pipelined into Germany, which was a manufacturing superpower. The goods manufactured in Germany, which again props up the entire European Union project, found a happy home in China and India and other places like that. Life was good. Now what? No natural gas from Russia. China and India are furious with the European Union, and local competition in China is swamping the European automotive industry, for example. And even your closest ally, the United States, who has got you addicted to expensive liquefied natural gas after literally pipelines to Russia have been blown up, is hitting you with sanctions and tariffs. Sorry, hitting you with tariffs. Sanctions and tariffs are the same word now. It doesn't really matter. But the U.S. Trump utterly embarrassed Ursula von der Leyen in Scotland. It was cringeworthy. I challenge people to watch that entire press conference in its totality. It's unwatchable how embarrassing it was for her. What has Europe gotten out of this? Where does it stand today compared to 5 years ago, 10 years ago? It's an utter catastrophe. And look, when you have a political catastrophe like this, people need to be held to account. And I think the entire architecture of the EU needs to be undone. And look, they will go down fighting. Their solution to everything is more Europe, which of course is the fundamental problem. And so it can only blow up in like a supernova of political revolution. And if you pushed us, we would say that time is much, much closer than most other analysts suspect.
Which based on what you just said, it proves a point. Why would Russia, you hear these people that say, Russia, they're going to take all over Europe. You have to stop them. Why would they? What is in Europe that they would possibly want?
What exactly? What does Russia want? Like, Europe is a basket case. What resources does it have? What prestige would it be? I mean, I know that it used to be that the European continent were the sort of the global apex of power, the colonialists, the Britain, the empire never set. The sun never set on the British Empire. Those days are long gone, right? Like, we try to do this numerically. Energy is the lens through which we view geopolitics, because physics is a really powerful adjudicator. And I'll just sketch some numbers for you. The Statistical Review of World Energy releases sort of the Bible of energy statistics every June, and then they just released the 2024 numbers a couple of months ago, and they started pulling out numbers for the European Union, the 27 member states of the European Union. Those 27 countries consumed a total of 38 exajoules of hydrocarbons, so coal, oil, and natural gas, and they produced like 5, which means they're importing 33 exajoules of energy. Before their industry can even start, they have to pay the cost of capital of everyone else's energy, exploration, development, and midstreamers, and LNG cargoes and oil tankers, and every entity that touches a hydrocarbon molecule somewhere else in the world that ends up in Europe needs to be paid, and they're paying that price before their steel makers and their automakers can get access to that energy. And that is not a foundation of geopolitical power. It just isn't. You're a vassal. But they walk around, they strut as though people should care what they think. And that is an act that's wearing very thin on the geopolitical stage. BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to see Putin, Modi, and Xi in China together, holding hands, literally holding hands, is sort of the picture that says 1,000 words. Europe's days are numbered, and the catastrophe, that is unfolding in Ukraine, we think, has to be a catalyst. If not that, then what? For the end of the EU.
Is it fair to say this is Trump's war now?
Not yet, but it's getting pretty close. Trump is nothing if not a survivor, right? And he has good instincts. He has unbelievable political instincts. Even his fiercest critics have to acknowledge that. And I think he knows the writing's on the wall. Look, just reread that post that he put out and imagine it's literal. If Europe could defeat Russia, they'd have done it long ago, right? That was the belief, by the way, in 2022. This war would be quick. Russia would be defeated. Why people think marching on Moscow is ever a good idea is sort of beyond me. But one thing Russia knows how to do is grind its way from east to west. I think it's proven that in its history. And they don't chase narratives or headlines. They will systematically fight and win a war of attrition, which is what they're doing.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question for you was, is Putin slow walking this? Because this is where, and I know they're not similar, but, with Netanyahu, let me share with you my thoughts and you tell me if you agree or disagree. In regards to the Middle East, people, you have pundits on the right saying, Netanyahu's slow walking, he's being very calculated, he's threading the needle. I'm under the belief that, he's having a harder time dealing with Hamas and Gaza and the Palestinians than maybe he anticipated. Would you, I don't know if you want to answer that part first, and then my next question would be: is there a parallel with Putin? Is he slow walking this, or intentionally, or is he having a harder time moving through?
So I broadly agree with your analysis of Israel. We've, ruffled a few feathers with our own views of the Iran-Israel war, the 12-day war. We think Netanyahu is wildly overplaying his hands, and Israel is very susceptible to another missile attack from Iran for reasons I'm happy to get into. But I actually think. Go ahead.
I was going to say please, but I didn't mean to cut you off in a sentence.
I mean, I'll let me answer your Putin question, and then we could return to the question of Israel. And make sure that we anger everybody listening at some point.
Let's ruffle all the feathers today,
yeah,
Doomberg.
Exactly. But look, we come at our views authentically and through our own, lateral thinking approaches internally, and we're not afraid to be wrong. And if people are upset by what we say or write, then they're always free to unsubscribe. And that's just the way this business is. So once you start trying to shape your views to what you think your audience wants to hear, you become far less useful. So Putin is playing it very slow. And contrary to Western propaganda, there's a growing chorus of critics in Russia who thinks Putin needs to drop the hammer quicker and more thoroughly. Putin is a careful player who moves slowly and cautiously. He's viewed internally as sort of meek and weak in Russia, something we covered in a Doomzoom presentation on lateral thinking that we published last month. And if there's any sort of regime change in Russia, the West is unlikely to be happy with the person who replaces Putin. The culture in Russia, given the catastrophes of the first two world wars, is just wildly different than those of the West. And Putin's successors would be far more likely to take the gloves off. Look, Russia doesn't even call this a war. They characterize it internally as a special military operation with the intent to impose sovereignty over the four disputed regions and to keep the sovereignty of Crimea. But in a world where Russia declared formal war on Ukraine and did a sort of a full campaign of recruitment and building up of large armies and using the entire repertoire of missiles and technologies that Russia has. For example, they've only launched one Orezhnik missile, and that was with dummy warheads. Russia could have long ago taken out all of the bridges over the Dnieper River and stranded the Ukrainian army on the wrong side of those bridges. They have not yet done so. They still might. But Putin is cautious and trying to get the objectives accomplished with the least amount of sort of devastation to the Russian economy and to the Russian people. That's not how it's portrayed in the West, and me saying that is going to cause people to wonder what I'm smoking, but that's actually our unbiased assessment of Russia. Back to Israel. We wrote a piece in October of 2024 called October Surprise, where we watched with interest the last sort of, the previous missile war between Israel and Russia, as truncated as that exchange might have been compared to the 12-day war. We watched Iranian missiles, seemingly powerful missiles with good targeting capabilities, easily piercing Israel's much vaunted air defense system, and we thought that this was a game changer. And we postulated that Israel could no longer really go to war with Iran because mutually assured destruction existed. Why did we come to that conclusion? Well, Israel gets like most of its power from 5 power plants and a huge amount of its water from 5 desalination plants and all of its natural gas from like 2 fields. That's a dozen targets, the geolocations of which are presumably widely known. And if Israel doesn't really have a golden dome, and Iran is one of the most technically sophisticated countries as it pertains to the development of ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles, that Iran could easily make Israel unlivable quickly. And so we postulated in October of last year that there could not be a war. And for many months we looked like we were correct. Because remember back then, during those first exchanges, there was fears that Israel would attack Iran's oil infrastructure, and that would cause, a global crisis. And so our subscribers, because we're predominantly an energy paper, were very interested in our views on the matter, and we said Israel's not going to attack Iran's oil infrastructure because mutually assured destruction exists. Well, fast forward to the 12-day war, and we were wrong. Okay, and one of the 4 axioms that we put forward in that piece, October Surprise, had to be wrong, and the fourth of those axioms was that Israel would recognize that mutually assured destruction existed and would behave accordingly. That was wrong. They did not either recognize it or behave accordingly. And in fact, when that war broke out, we immediately said, if this war isn't over in days, Israel's going to lose. And it was a decapitation strike, as you may recall. Their intent was to win it in a day. There was a hacking attack on Iran's air defense systems, which was apparently quite successful. There was targeted attack across the entirety of Iranian political leadership. That had mixed results. But we said internally, if missiles are still flying on day 3, 4, or 5, Israel's in big trouble. And on the 3rd day, I think that the Haifa refinery was attacked. The largest, really the only meaningful refinery in Israel, was severely damaged in a series of missile attacks by Iran, which proved our point. And then suddenly on day 5, I think it was, Israel implemented a severe censorship campaign. Videos from within Israel were deleted from social media websites and prohibited from being released. And so you really had to look to the dark corners of the internet to see what was going on, and we did. The Middle Eastern propaganda sites, and you could see videos of Iranian missiles day 7, day 8, day 9, day 10. And by day 12, we think the war was lost, and it was Israel who sued for peace, which is, again, wildly different than what is being reported in the media. But our mental model, we think, was right. And when Trump announced the destruction of the Iranian nuclear facilities on Saturday night at 10 p.m. Eastern, which is the deadest of dead zones for the news cycle, and nobody knows television better than Donald Trump. We call it the Saturday Night Live airstrike. We knew that the jig was up, and the oil markets had priced it correctly all along, and now here's where we are.
So what do you make then of Gaza and Netanyahu's approach of continuing to attempt to annex that area? Is it harder than he anticipates, and he not being successful?
So that's a situation we have not studied nearly as carefully, simply because our main priority is energy. And of course, Iran is an energy superpower, and so that part of the conflict we studied thoroughly. We think overall Netanyahu is very politically vulnerable. Israel has put itself in a difficult position. Again, not things we would ever write about, but the findings of the United Nations and all that stuff is putting a lot of pressure on Israel. But we tend to keep the focus of our analysis on the energy impacts, and this is why we studied the Iran war so carefully. Not so much to add on the Palestinian question, on the whole question of genocide and all of that other stuff. If we had something intelligent to say about it, I'd be happy to say it. I literally just don't.
Yeah, no, I was just curious what your thoughts were on it. So 2 questions then. As you just explained the 12-day war, and now you're seeing this, you're seeing these rumors circulate. Well, in today's world, there's rumors out there every single minute of the day, and it depends on who you believe when they put this information out. But do you think at this point some type of conflict from Iran will come back onto the table, or is this another good guys, bad guys, distract everybody with propaganda?
I don't know. My instinct is to go back to our original analysis, which is to say that unless Israel has rapidly invented a game-changing air defense technology, it's in no position to take on Iran again. But desperate leaders do desperate things during desperate times, and so who knows? The U.S. is chronically short air defense missiles. This was actually how we ended up going down the 12-day war path, because we were studying the war in Ukraine, we came to the conclusion that the U.S. was chronically short air defense missiles, and since Israel depends on the U.S. for 80% of its air defense missiles, it couldn't get into a protracted war with Iran, who has thousands and thousands of ballistic missiles it could launch. Since the 12-day war ended, you could bet your bottom dollar that China and Russia have been all over Iran, helping Iran rearm, to restore its air defense systems and to improve them. And so I think mutual assured destruction still exists, whether people see it or not, or recognize it, is a whole different story.
I know I'm running out of time here with you, but I'd like to talk about your latest Substack article titled, "Will China's Chip Ambitions Trigger the Next Financial Crisis?"
Sure. Yeah, an abrupt change, of course, but we write about a lot of things, and so I'm happy to address it. One of the themes of our work is that the West underestimates its opponents, which I guess is consistent with the whole Russia and Iran situation. The West, in particular, wildly underestimates China's ability to undercut the West in strategic industries. It's something we've experienced personally, we've seen over and over again, we've written about several times. And the sanctions against China, like all sanctions against strong countries, will fail. And the sanctions against China's AI industry, its semiconductor industry, its chip industry, will fail and will provoke the opposite of the intent. And if you just look at the entire U.S. stock market right now, you know, the big six, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Meta, Amazon, these are predominantly AI plays, compute plays, propped up by three legs of the stool. The first leg is NVIDIA's leading chip designs. The second leg is Taiwan Semiconductor's leading foundry technologies. And the third is ASML's leading lithography machines. And it's no coincidence that the U.S. has tried to impede China's access to all three of those. And that has forced China to invent its own domestic versions of those three things. And it is well on the way to doing that. And once it does, the entire edifice of the U.S. stock market becomes susceptible to Chinese competition, and China knows how to compete industrially. And the U.S. Treasury market is kind of backstopped by the stock market right now as well, and so it could spill into a real fiscal crisis for the U.S. And so the thrust of that piece was to assess where China is across those three dimensions and where we anticipate they'll be much faster than most would anticipate. But look, it's a story we've seen dozens of times across multiple industries. When China decides it either wants to or needs to dominate a strategic industry, it's pretty good at it.
Well, also with this, I was in Reston, Virginia this summer, and just happened to strike up a conversation with somebody in relation to they were working for AWS and building data centers all over the country. And what's incredible to me about, you never know who you're going to meet. It's so good to get out and assess things with your eyes, because you never know who you're going to come across and strike up a conversation. And these data centers that are being built all over the United States, they're not even being used for anything.
Yeah, I mean, there's a boom in data center construction for sure. And I understand that a lot of people think there's an AI bubble, and there probably is. But at the same time, AI is very, very transformative. And so whether all of the data centers announced will be built is an interesting question, one we're watching very carefully, of course, because of the energy implications, because these things need to be powered. But I anecdotes are interesting. They're certainly an input into analysis, but I wouldn't put too much weight on one. We've seen alternative views of data centers going up and being filled to capacity, as quickly as they can be built. But I think it is undoubtedly a lot of money is going to be wasted between here and there. Timing of all of this, of course, is of the essence. But at the same time, in 10 years, do we think AI will utterly transform every aspect of the economy? Absolutely, we do.
Do you think the companies like NVIDIA, Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, et cetera, that are, in the beginning or on the forefront or early in this AI cycle, some of them will get, because usually the first ones up are the ones that, don't make the money, right? They take the huge losses and then somebody else follows up behind them. What do you think the
I
future
would
of those six?
I would put OpenAI in that category more than those six. Those six are mostly survivors of the first dot-com crisis, and so if they know how to do anything, it's how to persist through cycles. Um, you know, I think there's an awful lot of hype in the AI space for sure. I think there's a lot of smoke around NVIDIA. So if I had to pick one that I would worry about, round tripping, accounting accusations, all of this other stuff. Those are all just accusations. I have no position. It's not investment advice. But if you force me to pick one, look, Apple has a real business. Microsoft has a real business. Amazon has a real business. Meta's a whole other conversation. NVIDIA, there's a lot of smoke around NVIDIA. And its most recent deal with OpenAI is eyebrow raising, to say the least. So we shall see. But if you push me today, the one I'd keep an eye on is NVIDIA.
Last question. I asked you what your biggest concern was at the start of this conversation. Let me ask you what your biggest concern is domestically in the United States.
Political stability, civil war. We're one assassination away from martial law. Very precarious situation, one that keeps me up at night. We have a very polarized society with people being spoon-fed outright propaganda. And one of the things that we think benefits our work is that we read everybody's propaganda. So we'll read Russian propaganda, Ukrainian propaganda, Iranian propaganda, Israeli propaganda, Turkish propaganda. And we live and swim and bathe in American propaganda. I mean, the Western outlets are legacy media outlets in the West are nothing more than propaganda houses as well. The reaction to the Charlie Kirk affair shows just how different the two universes are. And as I tried to warn my friends on the left, I live in flyover country. I feel like I know Bubba. Bubba's pissed, and Bubba owns a lot of guns, and won't be too much longer before Bubba starts fighting back, and that scares me, to be honest with you. I think a national conversation of healing is needed, and I'm not sure that anybody in the current political leadership roster is capable of having that conversation. Ironically, perhaps the one who could have was assassinated in Utah. And so it's not a hopeful way to end, I suppose, but that's what keeps us up at night.
Yeah, it's when I think about what you just explained, I try to remind myself too, and I don't want to take credit for this as my own, but I was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and because you follow that stuff that's going on in Portland and Seattle right now, right? And I keep talking about this journalist. I've been trying to get her on for a couple of years now, but she is always on the battlefield in regards to Antifa, and she's one of, if not the top targets of them harassing her. Her name's Katie Daviscourt, and I see like things like that could really escalate things to where that, or like the school board some of the school board meetings over the last several years where you see these angry parents, and oh my God, it's only a matter of time before somebody crosses that barrier, right? But then I think to myself as I look at Portland, I'm in the Midwest, and then Arizona. I'm in the Midwest currently, but Arizona is where I reside. If I'm in the Midwest or say, North Carolina, I mean, the United States is so big that just because something might happen in one of, a major city like a Chicago or New York, doesn't mean it's going to happen across the country.
Sure. I agree with that. But at the same time, DC is a city and that's the heart of power, right? And New York, Chicago, LA are pretty important for the U.S. political situation. And this all ties into the U.S. fiscal situation as well, right? Like social upheaval and unrest in the major cities is not conducive to financial stability at a time where the country is experiencing record deficits and has a huge amount of debt. And so, I agree with you in general. Look, if you push me, I'm very bullish the U.S. in the long term. It's an energy gigapower. It has amazing resources, amazing institutions that will probably persist through this. But we're heading into a challenging time. And it's not always guaranteed that you're going to come out of it in a great shape.
Do you think the challenging time could be worse in 2008, 1929 level, or where does it sit as we're in this storm? I wouldn't even say heading into it. I feel like we're in it now, don't you, Doomberg?
Depends on whether Trump can pull off most of what he's trying to do ahead of the political cycles of the U.S. There's a lot of money coming into the U.S., a lot of investment coming into the U.S. The U.S. needs to reindustrialize. It needs to onshore its military supply chains. It's working very hard to do that. Huge opportunities for people who can get ahead of that. There's things to be optimistic about. Look, when you produce 20 million barrels a day of oil and 107 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas, and you're sitting on the world's largest nuclear reactor fleet, and you have the world's largest coal reserves, proven coal reserves, and you have abundant hydropower and abundant farmland and abundant fertilizers and a healthy chemical industry, that's a pretty enviable foundation to grow from. So not all is lost. And again, if these civil disturbances, crises can be solved, then there's a clear runway to sort of an economic revival too. And in the end, look, whatever crises awaits us, there will be a rebirth. I mean, look, Japan was destroyed in World War II, and look what it became. Germany was destroyed in World War II, and look what it became at its apex in the post-World War II era. The U.S. is nowhere near that. The U.S. had political upheaval in the 60s and inflation in the 70s, and then it had the boom of the 80s and 90s. There's lots to be optimistic about as well, but we just can't be blind to the risks.
Where can people find you?
Doomberg.com is the primary. And if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind taking a moment to pitch another project that we just launched, which is a sister publication to Doomberg called Classics Read Aloud. One of the Doomberg co-founders and its longtime editor is very passionate about classic literature, and she started a new Substack, we have as a team that she's leading, called classicsreadaloud.substack.com. It's as the name might suggest, but also comes with sort of essays and et cetera wrapped around the reading of really great short stories, novellas, and novels. And so it's a bit different than what Doomberg does, but it will be done with the same, and it is being done with the same quality, attention to detail, and overall excellence that we try to do under the Doomberg masthead. So Classics Read Aloud, if you haven't stopped there already, would be great. And look, Mike, this was a fantastic conversation. Thanks for having me on, and happy to come back anytime you'll have me.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Congratulations on all the success you've had on Substack. I want to ask, how did Classics Read Aloud, how did that even come about?
It starts with get to. So our view in life is that you should only work on things that you feel like you get to do. And for the Doomberg editor, this is the ultimate get to do activity. And you start with things that you get to do, and you worry about how you monetize it later. Publication is free, at least for now. And who knows where she'll go with it or what value will come from it. But judging by the smile on her face when she gets to go and record in our new studio, the latest publication for Classics Read Aloud, she's on the right path, and she's found what she was meant to do. In a world of AI and social media and all the hate that we've talked about, escaping to the classics, hearing them as they were meant to be read. The MO of Classics Read Aloud is you're never too young or too old to enjoy being read to. She has a great voice, as you'll hear. And she's sort of a classically trained, classically educated person who makes for a great editor for Doomberg. So she's launched this project with our full support and help, and we know it's going to be successful.
I love the idea behind it, and and that's fantastic. I always every end of the year, I started doing this last year, I'm going to do it again this year. I have my regulars on, and we just talk about 80s and 90s movies for an hour because I love all that stuff. So I figured, let's put all the world and the world stuff on the table, and let's just talk about 80s, 90s, let's just talk about our favorite movies for an hour.
Yeah, I think if you go and give a listen to a few, give a read to the opening essays and listen to the readings, you might enjoy it.
I'm definitely going to. So I appreciate it. Congratulations with everything that you and your team are doing. And I look forward to following your work and more conversations ahead.
You bet. Thanks, Mike.
Mic drop.